you very much for joining us here today at 9.connects. You are in the right place if you are here for our webinar on demystifying the DbLib. So what I'd like to do is we'll put this up over here very quickly, but before we go any further, I do have a quick polling question for you. I'm just kind of curious to know if you've had any experience or understanding of DbLib. So we're going to put that up here right now. Okay, so it's actually an interesting collection over here. We've got some people who've used it regularly, about 1/5 of you here. A lot of you have heard of it, and even another, I'd say a quarter of you have never even seen it until we just sent this out here. So hopefully you'll find this interesting. We try to make this so hopefully it'll be even slightly entertaining. But what I'm going to do here today is we're going to talk about a couple of things. First and foremost, the similarities and differences between DbLink and DbLib. This is kind of important to understand, especially if you've already been using DbLibs and now you want to make use of DbLink as well. The second thing is to make DbLib successful. So a good portion of you said that, look, you tried it without success. 15% of you showed that. And I can totally understand that, because several times when I tried doing it, especially when I used to work at Altium, it seemed like it was very intermittent to me. So there's a couple of things we've got to understand in order to make sure it works right every single time. And then lastly, I'll talk about this, what I'll call alternative SPICE library with the DbLink file. With the alternative SPICE, the idea behind this is a different type of file. In fact, if you think about the miscellaneous devices, probably works rather nicely with this. And if we have DbLink there to assist us with it, we can really be able to use parts as necessary without worrying about whether or not that they are real or not, get the numbers or the values we need, and then find the real parts. And I'll go into a lot more details towards the end there. Okay, let's jump on here to our next slide here. I think it's important for us to go back to the basic foundations, that when we're using a program, that program, in order to get into even like a printer or into a database, actually uses a driver. And that is called the ODBC in this particular instance. And it's important for us to understand that, because when we're doing database work, Altium or SOLIDWORKS PCB, and we'll talk about SOLIDWORKS PCB as well, they can't just go into the database. It's like Microsoft Word just doesn't go into your printer and tell it how to work. It uses a driver, okay? And in this particular instance, when we talk about databases, we can talk about any type of them. We're talking about Excel, Access, MySQL, even the L9 one, which we represent here at 9.connects. And as a matter of fact, that's the one I'm going to be using as the backbone for all the examples that I'm going to be showing you. Now, Altium Designer can see both, or see these databases through DbLib, and it can see it through DbLink. It can also, in SOLIDWORKS PCB, you can simply see it through the DbLink as well. We'll talk about those differences here in just a minute as to what's the difference between those two types of things. As a matter of fact, let's take a look at this particular slide. So Altium can see it in two different ways. It can see it in a DbLib, which we're very familiar with, or a lot of people are familiar with, because that's just basically a database library. And then it has a DbLink. So the key difference between the two is that in a DbLib, I can place parts from that library or from that database. Whereas a DbLink, I can only extract data from that database. Okay, that's the major difference between the two of them here. Okay, and you'll see this as I'm going along, because these can become a bit confusing as we move along. Now, let's talk about the similarities and the differences between those. So the setup of the files is the exact same, and believe it or not, the access to the database is the exact same as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring this over. What I'm going to bring up is Altium Designer 18, so you can take a look over here. So when you look at these, here on the top, on the left side, I split the screen, you can see a DbLink file. On the right side, you can see a DbLib file. All right, and you can see that they look exactly the same. As a matter of fact, they're set up the exact same way. There's really no differences between the two in terms of any type of switches or features in them. The only thing you might see a difference, and I don't know how the clarity of the screen is, but one of the things you'll see here is that there is a single key lookup. And that single key lookup is something that we need to we'll talk a lot about here as we get going, because this is where a lot of people get confused about things. So yes, they are slightly different here, but you'll see why in a little bit. But when it really comes to these two files here, they look the exact same, and they can access they access the database in the exact same way. Again, Altium limits it so that the DbLib file, so if you go to the libraries panel here, you can actually pull parts from that DbLib. So if I go into libraries here, and I turn this on, okay, and I press close, I can actually see things from the L9 database or any type of database that I might have there, as long as the link is all set up there or the DbLib is set up there. So if I go here, for example, into discretes, I can see those parts here. If I go back into the library in Altium Designer and try to actually hook up the DbLink, it'll actually balk at me. It was one of the experiments I tried. It just won't work. Okay, so DbLink is specifically for updating parameters, as opposed to a DbLib, which I can update parameters, but I can't push parts in from as well. So there's the similarities, and there's a little bit of the differences there too. But let me get back over here to our PowerPoint, okay, and we'll take a look at that here. So if the rule of thumb is that if Altium can access the database through DbLib, it can definitely do it through the DbLink as well. And kind of a fun little thing over here is that my colleague Tim, who developed L9 and we at 9.connects represent L9, he never thought of at any point in time of using his L9 as a DbLink tool. But because Altium and SOLIDWORKS PCB can use DbLink, well, guess what? We have another alternative to another database there, and it works just as fine as using it as a DbLib. So I want to drive this home again. DbLib, it is for component or symbol placement or component placement updating, and DbLink is used for updating. All right, let's talk a little bit more about DbLink at this point in time. Why would we even bother using it? If we already have a database library, it's like, isn't that good enough? And in most cases for us, that is. But if you have information that might be in a company database, we'll call vetted information, then that information, okay, can be brought into both Altium Designer and SOLIDWORKS PCB. In fact, I remember many years ago, I think I was talking to Marty Huff when he worked at Altium. That was the whole intention of the DbLink, was that you had great information in a database. Is there a way to extract that database information and put it into Altium Designer, right? And later on also into SOLIDWORKS PCB. So that is its primary purpose. The second thing we've kind of come up with is what we'll call, and I mentioned it earlier on, is a simulation-driven library, where maybe you just want to use a library that has parts in it with access to simulation models, and by doing so later on, you'll figure out which actual parts you want to use, and you could use the DbLink to assist with that. Now, I know this question is going to come up, and we really have to spend some time with it, and that question is, can you use DbLink and DbLib in Altium Designer? And the answer is certainly so. But you have to do it with vigilance. In fact, this is where I was having a lot of problems when I was first learning it, because some days it seemed like it worked and some days it seemed like it didn't work, okay? So the scenario here, of course, is what I want to do over here is that let me go back over here. The scenario is that you have a local database with parts in it. And what's happening over here is that there is a need to extract not only information from your database library, but you also have data that is coming from the company library as well. Maybe that's vetted information. So you have a local database, that's where you're pulling your parts from, and then you also have your company database here as well. Okay, so there we are here. So that's really the idea of the use case scenarios for both DbLink and, of course, even with an Altium Designer if you've got both DbLink and DbLib. Now let's talk about some particulars about DbLink. First and foremost, the DbLink must be a part of the project. Oh my gosh, my technology is driving me crazy here. The DbLink file must be a part of the project, and if it's not going to work. So even if you have a free document, it's not going to work when we use it. We have to have a single key lookup relationship declared. I will talk more about this. This is really, really important. This is where I think most people have an issue. And then the second thing is we're going to use something called tools update parameters from the database. Okay? And this is a tool that I think a lot of people don't use, and for good reason, because again, it really does require, it certainly requires either DbLib or a DbLink. But again, depending on what you've got going on in your machine over there, this is where some of the confusion comes in. Here's another point of confusion I want to clarify here. For the so again, we're talking about this thing called single key lookup, and I'll show you in Altium Designer and in SOLIDWORKS PCB this thing in just a moment. We have to remember that part number actually has some special features in Altium Designer and even in SOLIDWORKS PCB. And in other terms, what we call part number is actually the design item ID, the actual name of the symbol itself. And I want you to remember that because later on we're going to see this in action here. Okay, that's all I want to show you for slides. I think it's really important for us to get into some examples over here. But first and foremost, I think we've got this over here. I wanted to show you that. We're going to actually jump over to SOLIDWORKS PCB. Okay, so and what I want to do is I want to show you an example of you pulling in database information through DbLink on parts that we've already placed. So what we've got over here is we have a project and we have our DbLink. So again, want to make that clear that if you're going to use a DbLink, it has to be a part of the project. We already have this set up, it's already connected. Notice that the single key lookup, and this is what I wanted to show you here, is really, really important. So why do we have this thing called single key lookup? Why do I not care about it in DbLibs, and now all of a sudden I care about it in DbLink files? Let me actually jump back to Altium for just a minute because it may be a little bit easier to explain. When we use DbLibs in Altium Designer, we're usually using it in two fashions. Either we're placing a part for the first time. So when we go over to our libraries panel and we see our parts, we want to place those parts for the first time. We already see the parts. So there's no reason for us to use a single key lookup file because Altium's already looking in there and saying, which one do you want? So we place that down and now we've got a part in our schematic. Later on, what happens quite often, and I'll jump to this a little bit earlier here, and then we'll go back to it later after I'm done with my example in SOLIDWORKS PCB. What happens is that we go into tools. We don't use update parameters from database. We use update from libraries. Well, the thing about update from libraries is that if it can't find the part, you are given control over finding that part. Okay, so as a result of that, we almost never use the single key lookup when it comes to a .dblib. So that's why you may not be totally familiar with it. However, when we're doing DbLink, and again, this is true in both Altium Designer and in SOLIDWORKS PCB, we are now telling Altium or SOLIDWORKS PCB, you need to go over to that database, shake hands with it, and I want you to look at a column with this particular name, and if there are values for any of the rows, because remember, a row is a record of a component, if this matches up with a part parameter, and remember, parameter is nothing more than a name and a value that's already in the schematic, with this exact same name over here, check the values. And if the values match up, then we've got a match, pull the information over. So this has to exist in the database, and this has to exist in the existing component that you already have placed. Now, does that work for DbLib? Yes, it does, and we'll go back to this here in a little bit. The database field here in this case is part number. That's what it comes up with by default. Now, part number is part number, which comes up by default. But remember, in Altium Designer, that's also known as the design item ID. Okay, so that's why, again, a lot of people feel like, hey, I've worked with database libraries. How come this is not working for DbLink? It's because of this single key lookup. But let me go to it. The reason I like to use SOLIDWORKS PCB is because it only has DbLink, it's kind of very straightforward, and that's what I want to demonstrate here. So I have this DbLink set up, and again, I'm going to use this database field called CPN, and I've got a part parameter called CPN. Let's go into this thing called miscellaneous parts, my schematic document. I've got two parts. Both of these came from the miscellaneous device library. Okay? There's a difference between the two. The first one over here, I actually typed in the CPN and I gave it a value. So there is something that it could actually correspond to in the database. All right? As opposed to over here, when I click into it, I do not have it. So they are the exact same way in every way, shape, and form, except one of them actually has a value or a parameter called CPN, or it has a parameter name called CPN with a value that I've given it, whereas this one doesn't. So with knowing all of that, I want to throw a little quiz at you and say, okay, I'm going to go into tools over here, and I'm going to go into update. So this is update parameters from database. It's the same thing that you'd see in Altium Designer. And my question to you is this, and we'll get the polling question up. Okay. The question is, are both of them going to be updated? Is one of them going to be updated, or none of them going to be updated? Okay, so we've got it over here. So remember what your answer is going to be, because I'm going to hit the magic button. By the way, before I do so, there's a really cool feature called Create Log if you want to turn it on. It will save it in your projects directory. It works great for SOLIDWORKS PCB. It works great for Altium Designer 18. It's a little problematic in 17, and I don't know if that goes back to prior versions as well. I think what was happening is it's saving it to the root directory, which you can't save to, so it gets a little fussy with it. But if you want to know what it did take in and what it didn't take in, this is a great way to do it. So you can create that log and take a look at it. For our purposes here, I'm going to hit the OK, and one part failed in the database. So which one did it find? So let's go over here. And I gave these identifiers specific designators so we could make it obvious as to which one. So the one that had the key field, the one that you would call CPN, because it had that CPN in there, it was able to go to the DbLink, find the information, and this is the information that I could pull in. So if I wanted to, I could do this. I can execute the changes over here, close this out. And if we want to see a difference here, we can go into this one. So this one's now filled with information from L9. And this one over here is still its original information because, again, it did not have the key field necessary for SOLIDWORKS PCB to look in the database and try to find a match. Okay, so hopefully I made that clear to you. You've got to have that key field in order for this to work. So the summary of it, your DbLink has got to be in your project. Your DbLink file has to have a single key lookup. Those parts have to have that key field in there with the corresponding value so that, in this case, SOLIDWORKS PCB, and again, Altium does the exact same thing. You can go to the database, make the match, and then show you a basically a proposed change list, an ECO list at that point in time. That's it with SOLIDWORKS PCB. Now I want to talk about Altium because Altium, it gets a little more interesting. So let's bring that up over here. So I created this thing here, and I'm going to go to a full screen here. So let's go to Documents here, and we'll do a merge all. And let's bring this up here. So I created a matrix because one of the problems I was having is it seemed like I was getting different results at different times, and I had to try to figure out what factors were involved in this. So there, it looked like to me there were several different factors involved, and so that's why I created what I did. If you look at the column represents the part that I pulled from L9. As a matter of fact, all of these parts came from a database. They all happen to come from L9. Okay? And again, doesn't matter the database at this point in time. It just came from a database. That's the most important thing. The second part of this over here is that what I did for each one of these rows here is I said, okay, I want to try this on different parts just to make sure that I'm seeing the same thing across different parts. And what I did was I said, okay, there's a couple of factors that seem to be playing some roles in this. Let me click on this over here to bring up the properties panel, and I'll lock it down here for a moment. So what were we seeing and what things we thought we were having an issue with? Well, one of them was definitely the name itself, the design item ID. Okay, so again, remember I mentioned that this was the part number. I want to mention that again. It's the design item ID is the part number. That seemed to be playing a role. Also, the source seemed like it was playing a role. And then, of course, when we go into the parameters over here, it seemed as though because of it's the way I set up the DbLink file, you'll see it, this CPN was also playing a role. And by the way, for our purposes, what's the CPN? It just so happens in L9, we use CPN as a unique ID for the particular part itself. It can either stand for category part number or component part number, but we just happen to use this. It really doesn't matter. You can pick anything you want. It should just be something that is a field with unique information. We just happen to use CPN, by the way. So that's what we wanted to do, is figure out what's going on with this. So what we did for each one of these rows here is we said, okay, for this particular part, we've got our CPN. Okay, we'll click over here. We've got our design item ID, which again comes directly from the database. We also have our source here, so we know where it came from. So those are the main things that we felt were going to have some use or comparison to go with here. And the second one over here, what we did was we said, all right, the only thing is we're going to remove the source because is the source causing us some type of issue? But it still has its CPN. Then we said, okay, let's keep the source. So I click down here on the third one, but let's no longer have the parameter. So the parameter has been removed. And then lastly here, we not only not have the parameter, we don't have the source. And that's what we did for all of these over here. All right, what we found eventually is that when we go into tools and we do update from parameters from the database, there was some confusion as to what Altium Designer was reading. And what we found is that it depends on whether or not you have your library turned on or it's not turned on. What I mean by that is we go into the libraries panel here. If there is, in this case we do have it, and we click on libraries, you'll notice the DbLib, it is enabled, it's activated. Therefore, what we have found is that when you go into tools, update parameters from libraries, guess what it's picking? It's picking this file, not the link file. Okay, so let's take a look at this file over here because we're going to run it and we're going to ask you a question here in just a moment. Okay, so let's open the DbLib file back again here. What is this doing? Well, again, it's linking to L9, but more importantly, what do we see over here? We see that the single key lookup is the part number. Okay, so I didn't change this, as opposed to if we go to DbLink, the DbLink is the CPN. So we are basically telling this DbLib to look things up based on the part number. Okay. So knowing that, and knowing that if we go back over here, all right, what the information we have here, I do have another polling question I want to put up here. So if I go back into tools and I'm going to run update parameters from database, take a look at this polling question, okay? And are they all going to be found? Are only 3 of them going to be found? Only 6 of them going to be found, or none of them going to be found? Okay, so let's take a look at this. Before I do one more thing. So again, what I am going to do is I'm going to show you the libraries. In the libraries, we do have the DbLib turned on. And now I'm going to go into Tools, Update Parameters from Database here, and I'm going to run it. And all of them were found. Why? The reason why all of them were found, we go back over to the DbLib over here, is because the database field was using the part number. And again, going back to what we discussed earlier, we click into this part over here, the part number is the design item ID. And in this case, all of these came from the database. Therefore, all of these would be found. So it was regardless of whether or not it had the CPN or not. And also, it's also regardless of whether or not it had the source or not. Okay. So it didn't require a key field. It didn't require this to even have the, we'll call pedigree over here, its source. All right, so I was able to find this because again, when we use the DbLib, it went with the part number, and the part number is the design item ID. All of these came from the library. Now, if I had something from miscellaneous devices, it wouldn't have found it. And even if I had a CPN, it wouldn't have found it because again, it was going based off a part number, and the miscellaneous devices, it doesn't come from a DbLib, it came from the library. So that's what happened over here. Let's take another scenario. So now I'm going to turn off the library. Okay, so if I go into libraries and I'm going to go over here and I'm going to turn this off. So at this point in time, Altium is actually going to use the DbLink file, not the DbLib file. So if we go into the DbLink, again, I set this up so it's not using part number. It's going to use the CPN. If I go back into L9, okay, the first 2 rows have the key field. So if I go back into this, you can see that. So let's bring up its properties. This one has it. If I click into it, this one will have it. If I go into these here, they will not have it. Okay. So I'm going to ask another polling question here. If I now run this with a DbLink, how many of these resistors are going to match up with the database? Okay, so we can close out the poll over here. All right, let's take a look. So again, this has been turned off. Just make sure here, go to libraries. I have disabled the DbLib, so it should read the DbLink. And if I go into tools and I go to update parameters from the database here, so I bring this up here. Again, we have our 12 count. I'm going to press OK. And we now get a fail of 6 parts. And again, the reason why 6 of those will fail, let me press OK and continue here. Notice the names over here. The names in this case were those that had the key field, the CPN. Okay, the one that those things that only had source. Let's go down here where it had source or it had none. It did not have the CPN, and we specifically set up the single key lookup for that thing called CPN, and that's why those 6 were missed. Okay. So that again is why you want to be really careful about how you set these things up. So. If there's questions afterwards, by the way, we'll have plenty of time to answer those, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how these type of things are coming together. Now I want to jump back over to SOLIDWORKS PCB because I want to talk a little bit about this library concept. And again, it's an interesting concept, and I think that if you are doing analog work and you do happen to have a company library where you have vetted parts, this would make a lot of sense. Now if you're a hobbyist or you are a or, just an individual where you wear multiple hats, I'm not sure this will be necessarily value add because you can certainly use the supplier links. But if you are in a larger company, this might be of some value to you. So let me bring this up over here. So here we go. We have an example of a power supply. If it looks somewhat familiar to you, we did take it from Altium's examples for SPICE simulation. SOLIDWORKS PCB can do SPICE as well. And let's just say that we've been working on this and we've been changing up values and we've tried to get this so that this will work accordingly. And we're happy with it. So if we run the SPICE simulator over here, we look at our waves, we're putting in 120 AC. Okay, so let's see if we can find our 120 AC. Here it is, 120 AC, and we're getting out approximately 6 volts DC. This is what we want. We're happy with it. Okay, so when we look at these parts, let's close this up over here. We look at these parts over here, we are, what we have over here is just rudimentary information. And why is that? Because we kind of set up a library. And if you think about it too, the miscellaneous library that both SOLIDWORKS PCB and Altium Designer provide, they really are just rudimentary types of things. If anything, one of the things they really provide and do a nice job with is they actually provide a lot of simulation models with it as well. But we created our own here just to kind of show an example of it. So let me bring up our power supply and go into our library here, so our schematic library. And I'll bring up the library panel here. So the idea behind this was not to give it specific parts, but rather to make sure whatever these, well, this is a terrible example, it's a header, but let's take this diode bridge here. So this diode bridge, you wanted to make sure that we did connect up its model in the library, so when we place the part, that model is already there. Of course, things like the resistors, which are a lot easier, but again, we can set those up here accordingly, and that's kind of what we did with all of these here. So there's no footprint here, and we do make we do have values. If they do require values, we can make those visible as well. Notice the other thing we've done over here as well. We've done CPN with an empty value, okay, because we don't know what CPN we want to use. We don't know what we want to use from our database because we just want to put down parts and change their values. And after we're done, then we say, okay, I know what my values are. Now I got to find some real parts. And if they happen to be in the company library and they're already vetted, then I want to use those particular parts. And so that's kind of the scenario that we're setting up over here. So if we go back over here to our project, I'll just click on it up over here and we'll see it. Let's assume that we already ran the simulation. It looks fine. Again, none of our parts over here have any type of footprints or any type of data that would lend us to some real parts. And I want to pull this from our company database. The difference is over here is that I have gone through, just for the sake of time, and I've actually entered in the values for each one of these. And I manually had to go in and change each one of those so that I would have that particular value, okay? And so we've got that, and you can see that here. So what can I do? At this point, I can run the DbLink, okay? So I've got my DbLink. There's one thing that, something a little bit different about this one that I would do as opposed to this one here. So this is the one we used for the last project. And again, you want one for each project. The one thing that I don't necessarily want to do is I don't want to update my values. As I learned the hard way in going through some of these examples here, you can, by the way, you can tell it whether or not you want it to update values or not. In this case, I don't, because the thing I found the hard way was that I set all these values, and then because L9 happens to have a parameter called values, it overwrote what I had with its values, and it broke my simulation, so I had to clean that up. But there's ways of turning on things, so if you don't want them to update values, you can do that here too, and that's probably the only major difference here. But the single key lookup is the exact same here as well, so I'm pretty much ready to go here. So if I go back into here and I go into my tools, again, go into update parameters. So I won't test you this time because I think it would be a tricky question. I'm going to press OK. All right, and you'll see it says fail to find 3 parts in the database. The reason why is because, number one, there's a V sign in here, which is just a simulation model, and there's 2 sockets over here, which are just really going to be pads that we're going to solder to anyways. So I'm going to press OK. Here is all of our information. Okay. And I'm going to accept all these changes, and I'm going to dump it in because the last thing I want to talk about is footprints. And actually, while it's doing this, let me talk about footprints. Parameter Manager works on parameters. It does not work on models. And of course, footprint is considered to be a model. So the good news is that if I go into something like, let's go into, for example, this transformer over here, what I'll find in all of this information is my footprint path and my footprint reference. Well, that's great. It's up here, but this is user information. It's not down over here. Now, yes, you could hit edit and you can go in and you could fix each one based off of the information off of here. But because this information got pushed in and because it's uniform, what I can do, and of course I can do this not only in SOLIDWORKS PCB, but I can do this in Altium Designer as well, I can go into Run Parameter Manager. If you haven't used this before, it's a really great tool. My recommendation is just click on parts, turn off all the other stuff, because usually you just work with the parts. Don't exclude the system parameters, especially in this case, because we need them. So I'm going to press OK. And really what I'm going to do over here is you'll notice that the footprint is empty except for the one for the basically the 2 sockets, because it already does have its footprint. We didn't delete that. But I just need to go to my footprint reference here, and I'll basically select this. I'll right click on it and I'll say copy. And I'll go over here to my footprints here. As long as I don't click on the top here, because if I do, I'll resort, and I don't want to do that. But if I click down on the first cell available, right-click on it, and I paste this, it's going to ask me if I want to replace all the cells. The answer is yes. Okay, and I'll accept the changes, and I'll execute those changes over here. So if I go back and again into my transformer here, you'll see now that the footprint model has now been added in. Okay. You may have to change something with the library, or make sure that that library, for example, the library I was pointing to was available, that particular PCB library. So you'd have to make sure it was set up in the libraries here so that it would be able to find it. But nevertheless, if everything is consistent, it should work out just fine. So there's hopefully an example of a type of library that you might be able to make use of. And again, the miscellaneous library that Altium provides, and SOLIDWORKS PCB provides, effectively does the exact same thing that I showed you in my library over here. Pretty much all their models have some type of simulation to them. As a matter of fact, some of the models that I use, I'll pull from there and extract out their information. Okay. So that is our presentation on this here. Let me talk a little bit about 9.connects. Actually, before I do that, there's two other things. First and foremost, if you have questions, please feel to write them in. I have plenty of time to talk about those. And if I can run a scenario for you, we can do that. The second question is, or the second thing is, we've got two polling questions for you. So I'm going to put that fifth polling question up here. I'm just kind of curious if you even use SPICE simulation. Okay, actually, the percentage of you using it is higher than I thought. That's great. Good to know. And then lastly, I'm curious to know, now that you've kind of seen this DbLib thing, hopefully I haven't added any more confusion to you, but are you more likely to use it here now that you've seen it? Okay, so I see that almost 3/4 of you said maybe here. That probably maybe is maybe if I watch the video one more time and understand what's going on, I'll use it. But hopefully I was able to clarify some of those things there. And again, I know it's one of those things where you just threw a lot at you. And again, for me, in my situation, when I first worked at Altium, just as a little side note, I had to write a 2-day class on library management. And I was working, it was coming along just fine. And then there was one day where I was starting to work on the DbLib. And it would work sometimes and it wouldn't work other times. And it dawned on me years later when I was putting this presentation together and I was trying to sort that out. It was because I had first done the DbLib first because I knew the DbLib. And I went to the DbLink, and the problem was that it was confusing, or I was confusing which one it was looking at. And I think that's the real key element here, is making sure you understand what's happening, which file Altium is going to use, whether it's DbLib and DbLink, and making sure you understand that key field lookup so that it can, so that you have that parameter in your component to your database parameter relationship that it can pull from. I want to talk a little bit about 9.connects for just a moment, and I'll jump to your questions there. I'm going to bring this on up over here and just going to kind of keep it plain and simple. Who are we here at 9.connects? Well, we are a PCB-centric organization. Obviously, we have a lean towards both SOLIDWORKS PCB and Altium Designer. However, we do work a number of other tools as well. We provide training, especially in SOLIDWORKS PCB and in Altium Designer. We also we're the creators and continue to teach through what we call a PCB Foundations class. So for those people who are just new to Altium or SOLIDWORKS PCB, or even the EDA industry in general, and just want to understand more about printed circuit boards, that's what that class is set up to do. We also do services as well, and we also do a lot of training, in training in terms of education and knowledge. Not just us coming on site, though we can certainly do that to train you, but we want to show you our knowledge because we know that in the end, there's not a lot of places to pull from a consistent point of view. There's little gems here and there, there's books here and there, but we want to provide that. We want to be really the beacon of light when it comes to PCB design. If you haven't had a chance, take a look at our website. So our knowledge base over here, our webinars are made available. We also have our videos on demand. If you don't see one of the webinars that you remember seeing there, then it's just a matter of simply putting in a request and we'll get you that link as soon as possible. And you can take a look at our various services and our design services as well. So here are different things that we train in, and also those things that we provide design services on as well. So, so that's what I want to do, talk about in terms of 9.connects. If you have any questions thereafter about what we do specifically, feel free to contact us. All right, and with that, I want to thank you very much for having you attend here today. Hopefully you found this educational, if not interesting. And we'll see you next month. So stay tuned. We'll send out our webinar for our next announcement in the coming days. You take care, and thank you.